In 2022, the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate doubled in less than 12 months. Millions of homeowners who had locked in rates below 3% suddenly watched their neighbors signing at 7, two almost identical houses, two completely different financial realities. That gap quietly changed the answer to one of the most common questions in personal finance. Should you pay off your mortgage early or invest that extra money instead? For years, the standard answer was simple. The market returns more than your mortgage costs you. Keep the debt, invest the difference, come out ahead. And for a long time, the numbers backed that up. Here's the part that does not get examined closely enough. If the math is so clear, why do so many people who followed it still feel financially stuck? Why does the spreadsheet say one thing and the lived experience say something else? That gap between the calculation and the feeling is what this video is about. If you never understand why those two things point in different directions, you will keep optimizing for a number while the actual decision quietly costs you. My name is Alex, and if you have ever stared at an extra $1,000 and genuinely not known whether to throw it at your mortgage or move it into your brokerage account, stay with me, because the answer changes depending on something the basic math does not measure. I'm going to show you what the spreadsheet gets right and what it completely leaves out. Once you understand both sides of this, you will not just know the smarter move for your situation, you will actually be able to make it with confidence. And that starts with the math case, because the numbers are not wrong. They are just incomplete. Here's the thing about a spreadsheet. It will never lie to you, but it will absolutely leave things out. The math case for investing your extra money instead of paying down your mortgage is genuinely straightforward. It is not a trick. It is not a sales pitch. Run the numbers honestly, and the logic holds up. But logic and reality have a complicated relationship, and that gap is exactly where most people get tripped up. So let's start with what the numbers actually say. If you took out a mortgage in the last couple of years, your rate is probably sitting somewhere between 6.5% and 7.5%. That is just the reality of where rates have landed after the Federal Reserve's hiking cycle. It feels high compared to what people were getting in 2020 and 2021. And it is. But in the context of long-run history, it is roughly average. Now, the stock market. The S&P 500 has returned an average of about 9 to 10% annually over the last 30 years, before adjusting for inflation. Over any single decade, that number moves around. But over long stretches of time, it has been remarkably consistent. So the basic argument goes like this. Your mortgage costs you 7%. Your investments earn you 9 or 10%. The spread is 2 to 3% in favor of investing. Do that math over 20 or 30 years, and the difference is not small. Let me make that concrete. Say you have an extra $800 a month. You are deciding whether to throw it at your mortgage principal or put it into a broad index fund. If you invest that $800 a month at a 9% average annual return over 25 years, you end up with roughly $860,000. Of that, you contributed $240,000 out of pocket. The other $620,000 is compounding, doing its work. You did not earn that money. Time earned it for you. That is not a small number. That is the argument in its strongest form. Now here is where I want to slow down for a second, because this is the part that usually gets glossed over. That 9 to 10% average return is real, but averages hide a lot. The market dropped 34% in 5 weeks in early 2020. It fell by 19% in 2022. Anyone who needed to sell during those windows did not get the average. They got whatever the market happened to be doing that month. The long-run return is only available to people who can stay in long enough to collect it. And then staying in requires not panicking. And not panicking requires not being financially stretched in the first place. This is the part that the spreadsheet cannot measure. Take someone like Marcus, a project manager in his late 30s, making around $94,000 a year. He read the math. He understood it. He kept his mortgage and invested the difference consistently for 6 years. Then he got laid off in a restructuring. No emergency fund deep enough to cover a 7-month job search. His mortgage payment was still due every month. He started selling investments at exactly the wrong time, in a down market, to cover expenses. The 9% average return he was counting on evaporated in the worst possible sequence. That is not a story about bad luck. It is a story about leverage. Carrying a mortgage means you have a fixed obligation regardless of what your income does. Investing the difference only works the way the math promises if everything else in your financial life stays stable. And for most people in their 30s and 40s, stability is not something you can guarantee. Now, I'm not saying the math is wrong. I'm saying the math assumes conditions that real life does not always cooperate with. There is also a subtler point worth sitting with. The gap between your mortgage rate and your expected investment return is not as wide as it looks on paper. Your mortgage interest deduction may be smaller than you think. Many homeowners no longer itemize after the 2017 tax law. Changes nearly doubled the standard deduction. So the effective after-tax cost of your mortgage is often closer to your stated rate than people assume. Meanwhile, investment returns inside a taxable brokerage account get reduced by capital gains taxes when you eventually sell. The raw spread of 2 to 3% narrows when you account for both sides. None of this makes investing the wrong answer. For many people, it genuinely is the right call. A long-time horizon, a stable income, a solid emergency fund, and the psychological ability to hold through a 30% drawdown without blinking are all real advantages. If you have all of those, the math works in your favor, and history backs it up. But most people are working with at least one of those variables missing. And this is where the conversation shifts. Because once you look past the spreadsheet, you start to notice that people who paid off their homes early rarely describe the decision in terms of basis points or expected returns. They use a different word entirely. They talk about what that monthly payment disappearing actually felt like. They talk about the human side of this and what it meant for their lives in ways no calculator ever captured. Nobody sits down at their kitchen table and thinks, I want to optimize my after-tax cost of capital. They think, I want to stop feeling like I'm one bad month away from a problem. That distinction matters more than most financial content will ever admit. The math case for investing is real. We just walked through it. But there is a parallel conversation happening that the numbers simply do not have the vocabulary for. And it starts with a question that sounds almost too simple to take seriously. What does it actually feel like to not have a mortgage payment? Not theoretically. Not on a balance sheet. In your actual life, on an actual Tuesday morning. People who have been through it describe something that is genuinely hard to quantify. Not relief exactly. Something closer to a change in posture. A shift in how they move through decisions. One thing disappears from the mental load they carry every month, and suddenly the entire financial picture feels different. Not because the numbers changed dramatically, because the pressure did. Here is why that feeling is not just emotional noise. Financial stress has a measurable effect on decision-making. When people feel financially squeezed, they tend to make shorter-term choices. They avoid risk when they should take it. They hold on to bad situations, a job, a market position, a living arrangement longer than they should, because the cost of making a change feels too high. The mortgage payment is often the number that sets that threshold. It is the floor everything else is built on. When that floor disappears, the whole architecture of your financial decisions can shift. The average monthly mortgage payment in the United States right now is just over $2,900. For most households, that is somewhere between 25 and 35% of their take-home pay. That is not a small line item. That is the dominant fact of the monthly budget. Everything else, savings, travel, career decisions, gets negotiated around that number. Now imagine it is gone. Not reduced, not refinanced, gone. That $3,000 a month does not disappear into a void. It becomes the most flexible money in your financial life. Some of it goes to savings, some goes to investing, some goes to things that actually make your daily life better. But more importantly, the absence of that obligation changes what feels possible. Options that were previously too expensive to consider suddenly become thinkable. Let me give you a concrete example. Diane is a high school teacher in her mid-40s. She and her husband made the decision 8 years ago to put every extra dollar toward their mortgage rather than into a brokerage account. People in their circle thought it was the wrong call. The math said invest. They paid off their home 18 months ago. 2 months after their final payment, Diane handed in her resignation. Not because she hated teaching. She actually loved it. But she had spent years wanting to move to a smaller district closer to her aging parents. And the salary cut that came with it had always been just out of reach. With no mortgage, the salary difference was manageable. She made the move. Her husband kept his job. Their fixed monthly expenses dropped enough that the income gap closed. That decision was only available to them because they had eliminated the one number that made everything else non-negotiable. No spreadsheet told them to do that. No rate comparison unlocked that option. The absence of a payment did. This is what the freedom conversation is really about, not freedom in the abstract, feel good sense. Specific, concrete optionality, the ability to take a lower paying job, to start something, to say no to something, to move towards something that a monthly obligation would have put just beyond reach. And there is a version of this that is even more straightforward than Diane's story. Sometimes the value of paying off a mortgage is simply this: sleep, actual, uninterrupted sleep. The kind that stops happening when you carry significant fixed debt through a period of economic uncertainty. Job markets shift, industries restructure. The people who feel that uncertainty most acutely are often the ones whose fixed monthly obligations leave the least room for error. Eliminating the mortgage does not make economic uncertainty go away, but it changes your relationship to it completely. There is a reframe here that is worth sitting with for a moment. Paying off your mortgage is often described as a conservative, low-return financial decision, and compared to a fully invested portfolio in a strong bull market, that framing is not wrong. But it misses what you are actually buying. You are not just paying down a balance, you are purchasing a reduction in your minimum monthly cost of living. You are buying the ability to survive and make clear decisions on less income. That has a value that does not show up in a rate comparison, but it shows up everywhere in the life that follows. The question is not whether that value exists. It clearly does. The question is whether it is worth the cost in foregone investment returns. And to answer that honestly, you have to look at what carrying a mortgage into retirement actually does to the numbers, because that is where the real cost reveals itself, and the retirement math tells a story that most people are not prepared for. Most retirement planning conversations start in the wrong place. They start with how much you need to save. The more useful starting point is how much you need to spend, because those two numbers are not mirror images of each other, and the gap between them is where a lot of retirement plans quietly fall apart. Here is the mechanism that does not get enough attention. When you retire, your investment portfolio has to do something very specific. It has to generate enough income to cover your fixed monthly expenses for the rest of your life without running out. Financial planners generally use a withdrawal rate of around 4% annually as a rough, sustainable benchmark. That means for every dollar of monthly expense you carry into retirement, you need somewhere between $250 and $300 sitting in your portfolio just to cover it. Now apply that to a mortgage payment. The average monthly mortgage payment right now is just under $3,000. If you carry that payment into retirement, your portfolio needs to generate enough to cover it every single month, on top of everything else. Run the math at a 4% withdrawal rate, and a $3,000 monthly mortgage payment requires an additional $540,000 in retirement savings, just for the house, just to tread water on a debt you have been carrying for 30 years. That is not a rounding error. That is more than most American households have saved in total. And here is what makes that number feel even heavier. It does not include property taxes. It does not include insurance. It does not include maintenance. It is purely the principal and interest payment. The actual cost of carrying a mortgaged home into retirement is higher than the mortgage payment alone, which means the portfolio cushion you need is higher still. Now, zoom out for a second. According to recent data, roughly 44% of homeowners between the ages of 60 and 75 still carry a mortgage. That is nearly half of all homeowners in the years immediately surrounding retirement. This is not a fringe situation. It is the median outcome for a generation that was told, correctly, that investing the difference was mathematically superior. The math was right. The retirement arrival point was not what they expected. Let me show you what this looks like for a real person. Robert is a 58-year-old operations manager. He has spent his career making good financial decisions by most conventional measures. He maxed out his 401k, which is his employer's retirement account, for the better part of 2 decades. He has a solid brokerage account. On paper, he looks prepared, but he refinanced his home in 2019 and has 17 years left on his mortgage. His monthly payment is $2,800. When Robert sits down with his retirement projections, something uncomfortable surfaces. His savings are substantial, but his fixed monthly obligations are high enough that his sustainable withdrawal rate barely covers his baseline expenses. He cannot afford to have a bad sequence of returns in his first few years of retirement because his spending floor does not flex. The mortgage payment is due whether the market is up or down, whether his portfolio just dropped 15% or not. This is called sequence of returns risk, and carrying a mortgage into retirement makes it significantly worse. A retiree who hits a market downturn in the first 3 years of retirement and has to sell assets to cover a mortgage payment is doing permanent damage to their portfolio. They are selling low and removing shares that can never recover for them. The math that looked clean during accumulation gets ugly fast during distribution. There is also a psychological dimension that is easy to underestimate. Retirement is supposed to reduce financial anxiety, not sustain it. But for people carrying significant fixed debt, the feeling of financial pressure does not automatically lift when the paycheck stops. If anything, and it sharpens. Every market dip becomes a question of whether the mortgage is still covered. Every unexpected expense competes with a payment that was already consuming a significant share of the monthly budget. The retirement they saved for does not feel the way they imagined it would. Compare that to the retiree who arrives with no mortgage. Their fixed monthly expenses are dramatically lower. Their portfolio does not need to work as hard. They can absorb a down year without touching their principal in a meaningful way. They have room to be patient, and patience in retirement investing is worth an enormous amount because it means you are not forced to sell at the worst possible moment. The difference in required portfolio size between these two scenarios is not marginal. It is the difference between a retirement that works and one that requires constant management and hope that nothing goes wrong. Here is the honest framing. Paying off your mortgage before retirement is not just a sentimental goal. It is a structural decision that reduces the amount of capital you need, lowers your exposure to sequence risk, and changes how much pressure your portfolio operates under for potentially 20 or 30 years. That is a concrete financial advantage, not a soft one. And once you see it that way, it stops being just a retirement question. It becomes a question about how you build wealth over the entire arc of your financial life. Because paying off your mortgage early is not just about eliminating a payment. When you look at what it actually does to your net worth and your ability to take meaningful risks with your money, it starts to look a lot more like a deliberate wealth strategy. There is a pattern that shows up consistently among people who build lasting financial stability, and it is not the one most financial content focuses on. It is not about picking the right stocks. It is not about timing the market. It is something much more structural, and it starts with a concept so basic that it almost sounds too simple to take seriously. Net worth. What you own minus what you owe. That is it. Two variables. And for most American households, the single largest entry on the outside of that equation is the mortgage, which means the single most powerful lever for improving net worth, not gradually but immediately and permanently, is eliminating that number entirely. This is not a complicated mechanism, but it is one that gets underappreciated because the financial conversation tends to focus almost exclusively on the asset side of the equation. Grow your portfolio, increase your returns, compound your savings. All of that matters. But if your liability column is large and fixed and growing with interest, you are running with a significant drag that the asset side has to overcome before you actually get ahead. Here's what that drag looks like in real numbers. Say you have a mortgage balance of $220,000 at a rate of 7%, with 15 years remaining. Over those 15 years, you will pay approximately $104,000 in interest alone. That is money that leaves your household and does not come back. It does not compound. It does not appreciate. It generates no return. It is the cost of carrying the debt, and it is substantial. Now here is the reframe that changes how this feels. Every extra dollar you put toward that mortgage principal today does not save you $1. It saves you $1 plus the interest that dollar would have accumulated over the remaining life of the loan. An extra $10,000 applied to the principal today on that same loan saves you closer to $17,000 by the time the mortgage would have ended. The return is guaranteed. It does not depend on market conditions. It does not depend on what the Fed does next quarter. It is a certain outcome in a world where almost nothing financial is certain. George Kamel, a well-known personal finance commentator, has described this as a forced savings plan with a guaranteed return. That framing is useful because it puts mortgage paydown in the same mental category as investing, rather than treating it as the boring, defensive alternative. It is not defensive. It is a risk-free return at your mortgage rate, which right now, for most people, is somewhere between 6.5% and 7.5%. You would be hard-pressed to find a guaranteed return anywhere close to that in any conventional savings vehicle. Now look at what the data says about how financially successful people actually behave. Research into the financial habits of high net worth individuals consistently shows that they eliminate mortgage debt faster than the average homeowner. The median time to full payoff among millionaires is around 10 to 12 years, compared to the standard 30-year term most borrowers sign up for. And that is not because they have so much money that the mortgage becomes irrelevant. It is because they understand something about the relationship between fixed obligations and financial flexibility that the standard advice glosses over. Let me show you how this plays out for a real person. Priya is a 41-year-old pharmacist, earning around $112,000 a year. 7 years ago, she made a decision that her colleagues thought was financially suboptimal. Instead of maximizing her taxable brokerage contributions after her retirement accounts were funded, she started sending an extra $1,400 a month to her mortgage principal. The math, her colleagues pointed out, did not favor it. Her mortgage rate was 6.8%. The market was returning more than that on average. She paid off her home last year at age 40. Here is what changed immediately. Her fixed monthly expenses dropped by $2,600. That money did not go to lifestyle inflation. It went directly into her investment accounts. She is now investing more per month than she ever was while carrying the mortgage, with zero fixed housing debt and a fully owned asset on her balance sheet. Her net worth jumped by $230,000 the day she made that final payment, because $230,000 of liability simply ceased to exist. That is the mechanism. Eliminating the debt does not just remove a payment. It converts a liability into an asset, increases net worth immediately, and frees up cash flow that can now be redirected toward growth. The sequence matters. Pay off first, then invest aggressively from a position of strength, tends to produce a different financial life than investing while carrying the debt in parallel. This is the defense and offense framework that rarely gets articulated clearly. Paying off the mortgage is the defensive move. It lowers your minimum cost of living, reduces your exposure to income disruption, and removes the largest fixed obligation from your monthly budget. That defense is what makes the offense possible. Once the payment is gone, the cash flow it consumed can be deployed into investments without the psychological and financial weight of carrying debt underneath it. The people who understand this are not choosing between paying off their mortgage and building wealth. They are using one to accelerate the other. And that, ultimately, is what brings this entire conversation back to the only question that actually matters for your specific situation. Because none of this, not the math, not the freedom, not the retirement numbers, not the wealth strategy, means anything until you figure out your personal why. That is where the real decision lives, and it is more individual than any formula can capture. Here is what this whole conversation really comes down to. The mortgage versus investing debate is not a math problem with one correct answer. It is a question about which financial pressure you are most willing to live with, and for how long. Both paths require discipline. Neither one works if you stop there. What the numbers cannot tell you is how a fixed monthly obligation changes the decisions you make, the risks you are willing to take, and the options that feel available to you. A paid-off home does not just improve your balance sheet, it lowers the floor of what you need to survive, which quietly changes everything built on top of it. A few things are worth carrying forward. Guaranteed returns are rare. Your mortgage rate is one of them. The spread between your rate and your expected investment return is almost always smaller than it looks once taxes enter the picture. And the math only delivers what it promises if your life stays stable enough to let it run. Watch how you make decisions under financial pressure. That is usually where the real cost of carrying debt shows up. There is a related question worth sitting with. If eliminating a mortgage changes what risks feel acceptable, what does that imply about the order in which you should be building?